Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Limited Time Only. I'm your host, Spencer, and I am joined by my co-host, Drew Walden.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
What's up, Drew?
Oh, nothing much. Just was at Comic-Con all last weekend, so...
More than last weekend. You got there on, Thursday, right?
I was helping to move everything and get it into place on Wednesday, and then we even had to move stuff out of the convention hall on Sunday. So it was a pretty long weekend.
Well, there you go. Speaking of Comic-Con, it was a really fun tournament that you guys ran from Game Grid.
Yeah, it was, we felt like we didn't have quite enough time to really get prepared for it, so we tried to do, with what we had available to us to get it going. So we definitely want to hear some feedback from the players and find places we can improve, find the things that people liked, and then hopefully next time we run a tournament at a convention, we'll have, I think just be better prepared and maybe get more players to show up as well.
Yep, absolutely. Definitely really fun. Obviously, taking it down was really fun, so it was high value for me, and now I get to play in the Game Grid Invitational.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's happening at the end of the year in December, so tons of prizes there. Were you playing Ramp? I didn't get a chance to really see anything.
Yeah, I played an updated Ramp list from what Casey qualified for the Pro Tour with.
Okay, cool. So you felt like it was pretty good for what you were playing against?
Yeah, I think that it's good. It's pretty good against the Bant Company decks. And then it's really, really good against Temur Emerge and Green Black Delirium, and that's all I really played against. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and the aggro decks like Mono White and the Burn decks are really good matchups too. So it was a good choice and a really fun thing for the event itself. But this podcast is not about Constructed. This podcast is about Limited. It's brought to you by Game Grid and 5-Color Combo. We're going to go right into our pick 2, where we pick picks 2 and 3 in a booster pack and talk about why we take them, and discuss a little bit more in depth of our picks and things like that. We'll get right into this with Eldritch Moon, and we will start right now. All right, so just so you know, this segment is brought to you by 5-Color Combo. You can go to 5colorcombo.com. And check out their website, as well as Magic Drafter on the App Store, as well as the Google Play Store. Our first pick is something that I have yet to play with, but have played against multiple times, Drew. It's Docent of Perfection. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, Docent of Perfection. This card's quite powerful. I've played with it once or twice. It's absolutely insane if it lives, so...
Yeah, I played against it once and just insta-killed it.
Yeah, you pretty much, if your opponent plays it, or if you play it, the opposing player, I think, generally has to kill it on the spot. Otherwise, it will just take over a game very quickly.
Yeah, it's the 5/4 flyer that puts 1/1s into play when you cast instant or sorceries. And then if you control 3 wizards, you flip it into a 6/5 that gives wizards +2/+1 in flying, and then continues to put wizards into play. So it makes flipped Delver of Secrets on the backside.
Yep, I would say this is basically a bomb. I mean, even without any spells, this is still very good, right? It's a 5/4 flyer for 5 mana, so...
Yep, absolutely. All right, so get right into this. We have our first option is Filled in Pack Outcast. That's the card that's gotten a lot of press on this podcast. From me, I think the card is quite strong, and I would be okay second picking it, but not the most excited.
Yeah, after taking a Docent of Perfection, I don't really want to take a ground pounder 5-drop, especially because you generally these two don't necessarily pair well together. I mean, blue-red is where you want to be, but Build and Pack Outcast is not necessarily a blue-red spells card. So I would not be looking to take this.
We have Prophetic Ravings, which we're not taking. Of the Horde Swarm, I don't think that card's even as good as Outcast, so I wouldn't be taking it here.
No, I don't think I would be taking it either. I mean, it's still decent. I like it a little bit better than Outcast, but I'm hoping to maybe get like a Galvanic Bombardment or something like that.
What about Ingenious Scob, which is the next card, 2 and a blue for the 2/3 with prowess?
I do like Ingenious Scob. So in fact, it's my mover for the week. I like the card a lot, and I actually think it goes quite well. Obviously, with Docent of Perfection, fills out the curve a little bit, gives you another decent payoff creature for having spells in your deck.
Yeah, I would move this card to the front over Outcast also. We're not going to take a Falcon Wrath Reaver or an Otherworldly Outburst here. Waxing Moon also not in there. Sigardian Priest. I don't even know that we've talked about this card on this podcast yet.
Yeah, I guess it just hasn't come up in any of our picks. I think I generally feel about Priest how I felt about the card at the beginning of the set, which is it's just a really good tapper. Has the downside of you can't tap humans with it, and that does come up occasionally. For example, a lot of times you can't tap down a larger werewolf on its front side, but generally it's still quite strong, still a very good creature. I think I would still take Ingenious Scab here, I think, but I do really like Priest a lot, so...
Next up, we have Alchemist Greeting. It's 4 and a red for a sorcery, deals 4 damage to target creature, and you can cast it for Madness for 1 and a red.
This card's pretty good. I think it's a little bit interchangeable, mostly because of the presence of like Reduced to Ashes. Obviously, this I think is still better because you have the potential to Madness it, and when you do that, it's great. If you discard this to if you buy it back with the Shreds of Sanity and then discard it, it's quite good. So I think this is pretty close actually so far between either Scob or Greeting.
I think it's really close. Next up we have Displace, which we wouldn't take. Haunted Dead, 3 and a black for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1. You can pay 2 to discard 2 cards to put it from your graveyard into the battlefield.
This is a pretty good black uncommon. It's by itself, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good rate. It's like a Hill Giant worth of stats, but it's split up between 2 bodies. And one of the bodies is a 1/1 flyer. So I think on its front side, this is slightly better than a Hill Giant, but then obviously the fact that you can buy this back from your graveyard for the cost of like 2 mana and 2 cards is good, especially if you do have Madness cards to get some value out of it. That being said, with Docent of Perfection, I've said this before, you really want to play your really powerful cards. Docent of Perfection is very, very powerful. So I think I would rather take Scab or Greeting at this point.
I also would. Peace of Mind we're not taking. What about Ride Down?
Ride Down is good in an aggressive deck, and that's about it. You want your deck to be really, really aggressive. Like if you're any sort of mid-range deck, this can be a little bit worse, but it's still generally going to be pretty good. But I would not be taking it at this point.
So it leaves us with Alchemist Greeting or Ingenious Scob, and I think it's really close.
Yeah, I do think it's actually quite close as to which to take. I'm leaning a little bit towards Alchemist Greeting, mostly just because it is a removal spell, and there's a ton of upside if you Madness it, right? Like, it's very, very good when you Madness it.
I would take Greeting also.
Yeah, I think Scob is very, very good, though, and I don't feel like you would be wrong for taking Scob over Greeting. I think the 2 cards are insanely close, and both cards are very good in the Docent of Perfection deck, so...
Yeah, I think that Scob is actually probably better, but I think that, and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe you should, because of how easily it is to replace Greeting, you shouldn't take it, but I would take Greeting here. Let's move on to the next choice we have. We have another Outcast, which is totally fine. I would move that close to the front. We have Wretched Griff, which I would move in front of the Outcast.
Yeah, pretty easily. I think even a spells deck, I'm still happy having Wretched Griff in my deck.
Yeah, absolutely. Succumb to Temptation, not taking that. Cemetery Recruitment, not taking that. Choking Restraints.
So we get another good white card, which is kind of sending me a little bit of a signal that white seems pretty open on the right, but blue still seems open as well since we have a Wretched Griff in the pack still. So, normally I like Choking Restraints, but I don't think I would take it over Wretched Griff at this point.
Yeah, blue's even more open. There's an Ingenious Scob next up.
Yep, that's a really nice signal. So I think I still like Retchgriff more than
I,
Ingenious Scab, but I'm kind of
actually,
sad passing two of them.
I would actually take Ingenious Scob over Retchgriff.
Really? I
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think that Retchgriff is great. Maybe I'm wrong because Retchgriff is probably the best blue common, but I want to set myself up to have the best deck possible with my. No, I would take Retchgriff. I've already talked myself out of it.
Yeah, I'm like even in a spells deck, I think Retchgriff is still very good for your deck.
Yeah. I talked myself out of it real quick. Um, Next up we have Bold Impaler, which we're not taking. Stancia Banquet, which we're not taking. Thermal Alchemist is 1 in a red for an 0/3 defender. You can tap it to deal 1 to each opponent, and then if you cast a spell, you untap it.
This card is very good. I'm still taking Retchgriff, but I do like the fact that I'm seeing both the Thermal Alchemist and an Ingenious Scab third pick at this point. So
Yep. Next up we have Insatiable Gorgers, also not taking that over the Griff.
nope.
That's still quite good. Faith Unbroken, another white card that's pretty good. And Vexing Scuttler, which is the 8 mana 4/5 that you may to return an instant sorcery from your graveyard to your hand when you emerge it.
All right, so basically what I'm learning from this pack is we're not going into black or green.
Yeah.
There's plenty of great white, blue, and some decent red cards, but mostly white and blue definitely seem very open on our right. I think I don't know.
Are you tempted to take the Scuttler?
Yeah, I actually think it's kind of close between Scuttler and Retchgriff. I think in a vacuum you want Retchgriff more than Scuttler, but Scuttler is one of the good cards in the spells deck.
I would take Scuttler.
Yeah, I mean it's the ability just to buy back whatever your best spell in your graveyard is very very good. So yeah, I would probably take Scuttler here.
All right. That does it for pick 2. What is the reason that we like Scuttler? They're just the fact that it's still a big body but has more upside in the long run, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, buying back a spell is better. So buying back a spell is better than drawing a random card. But the 3/4 body, flying body on the Retchgriff, I think is a little bit better than the 4/5 body. But in the spells deck, this does a lot of work. It blocks most ground creatures very well, which generally in the spells deck, you're generally going to be a little bit behind in terms of your opponent advancing the board a little bit more. So a lot of times you end up playing a little bit of catch-up in the middle turns of the game, and Vexing Scuttler does a very good job of doing that.
All right, let's move on to our next segment, which is biggest movers. You already mentioned yours. What is your biggest mover this week, Drew?
Ingenious Scab. I mean, I knew the card was good, but I definitely think it's even better than I think I was giving it credit for. A 2/3 body for 3 is a fine card, but this has a ton of other things going on. It gets bigger with prowess. It can be very difficult to block. It trades with a lot of creatures, even creatures that are more expensive than this cost. I mean, this thing trades with like werewolves a lot of the time, not always, but occasionally. So I think this card is very very good in the blue decks, and I really like blue and Eldritch Moon. So
yeah, my biggest mover this week is a card that's easily one of the better uncommons in the set, but I think that it's underrated. And I'm gonna talk about why, and that's Lashweep Lurker. It's a 5/4, 3 emerge, 5, a green and a blue, and then when it enters the battlefield, when you cast it, you put a permanent on top of its owner's library. And the thing is I don't think people realize how easy this card is to splash. Or, like, sometimes you might not even splash it. Sometimes you might just cast it. Which is not the best. It's like a lot to ask for an 8 mana spell, but I think that it's really easy to splash.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a reasonable splash card. And obviously when you're in those colors, it's very, very good. Obviously it's very easy to cast, but yeah, the effect is quite powerful, right? Generally with the 7 mana emerge cards, what you're looking to do is have a 3-drop and then curve into the 4-drop emerge creature. So on turn 4, when you get a 5/4 that time ebbs your opponent's best creature, generally it's your opponent's best creature, it's a very powerful play, and it's still quite good in the late game as well. Locking your opponent. I remember this wasn't Lashweed Looker, but it's the same idea. I ended up casting like a Gone Missing 3 times on my opponent's Stallion of Ashmouth when he was Hellbent, and so he just kept drawing a 3/3 over and over and over again. Which you might not quite get that chain of effects with a Lashweed Lurker, but it's still the same idea, right? You're putting your opponent's creature, you're locking them out of their draw because they may be looking for a removal spell, and they just end up drawing a creature. So.
And it's very likely that they're looking for a removal spell because you just added a giant guy to the board.
Yep.
So, let's go on to our training cards this week. So every week on the show, we've talked about something that's going to help you get better at Magic or life in general. This week, we want to talk about understanding resources in Limited. And don't forget that it is brought to you by GameGrid. You can check them out at play@gamegrid.com to see all of Drew's articles. We will be launching the end of the show. At the end of every week, we will start doing the How You Would Build It again, where we talk about a sealed pool. And that will start with the next set. And you can check out those sealed pools at play@gamegrid.com, where you'll be able to see them, comment, and let us know how you would build those sealed pools as well. But this week we are going to talk about understanding resources in Limited. And there's a lot of resources to talk about. Permanence, removal, things like that, spells, different things like that. I want to start with guys, Drew. There's 3 main things I want to talk about. I want to talk about bears. I want to talk about like 2/2s, 2/1s, those style of cards. I want to talk about high power and high toughness creatures. So, 4/2s, 2/4s, 5/3s, 3/5s. And then I want to talk about bombs. Drew, what kind of a resource why would I separate any of these things out? Isn't a creature in the end of the day?
So basically what you're doing at this point is you are evaluating first, I think what you're really doing in Limited is you're evaluating whether the creature is worth a slot in your deck, right? You're kind of making a decision. You're saying, is it worth playing a 2/2 for 2 mana in your deck? I would default to yes in an unknown Limited set, but as Limited sets develop and evolve, you will kind of begin to skew whether you want a 2/2 for 2 in your deck or not. And specifically high power or high toughness creatures, looking at it as a resource, what you're doing is you're saying to yourself, do I want to be attacking with these creatures a lot? Am I going to be blocking with these creatures a lot? And really what your deck is looking to do in the middle of the later turns of the games.
Yeah, I think that when I think about something like a Cobble Brute, for example, we've all lost to a Cobble Brute and wondered how this happened to us in our lives, right? But there are certainly decks that might want a Cobble Brute. And then there's things like a Catacomb Slug, right? I think that I've lost to a Catacomb Slug before and felt like my life was over and that I could never recover from that. But, at the same time, it's something that it's a resource that was available to that player that they chose to build their deck differently and play differently because they had a Catacomb Slug in their deck to lock down the board, right? And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the other thing with cards like that, with like Catacomb Slug and Hulking Devil, which is kind of the twist on Cobble Brute, is that those are the kind of cards that you want to evaluate with sideboarding as well, right? Sometimes your creatures like that will match up very well versus your opponent's deck, and sometimes they won't match up well at all. For example, I was playing Aaron in a draft at the beginning of this set, and he had like 2 or 3 Silent Observers, the 1/5 flyer for 4, as well as several 1/3s for 2, and I boarded in Hulking Devil because I knew that it would match up very well versus his 4-drops, whereas anything else, like a 3/3 for 4, or even like a 4/3 for 4, doesn't match up well versus an Observer, right? He can just block it all day, but a Hulking Devil can kind of smash through it. So that's another thing to consider is, what creatures are your opponents playing? Will your creatures match up well versus them? Or if you're playing a Hulking Devil and your opponent has a ton of like 2-power creatures, you probably don't want it in your deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great explanation of that. And also, I think it's so easy to lose sight of something like it's so easy to lose sight of a textless creature, like for example, like a Cobble Brute or a Catacomb Slug and thing. This isn't something that I would want to ever play, but at the same time, sometimes it's what your deck needs, and it's a resource that's available to you in that deck building stage of the game, even. The 2-2s is another one that I want to talk about. The difference between a 2-1, a 2-2, a 2-3, a 1-3. These little guys that determine what a format looks like. Drew, what is their importance and their role in the formats?
I mean, really, a lot of times these creatures will dictate sometimes the tempo of the format. If there are a lot of high power creatures, say like 2-1s or 3-1s, and there's not a lot of good ways to trade favorably with these creatures in the early stages of the game outside of trading your own high power creatures with them, a lot of times that's where like aggressive formats come into play. But if there's a lot of creatures that interact well with those creatures, then the aggressive creatures kind of start to get worse and worse and worse, right? Like if there's a lot of 2-3s, for 3 running around in the format, or 2-3, or even tokens, right? Like if there's cards that make a lot of tokens, then what ends up happening is that like 2-1s tend to get a lot worse, and so the format can kind of get slowed down because of that. And really, a lot of that comes down to the availability of the creatures to the particular colors, and as well as, I think, are there cards that make 2-1s better, possibly, right? Like, is this an enchantment-heavy format? Are enchantments better in this format than other formats? Does that make smaller creatures better because you're able to enchant them? And a lot of that is obviously going to be determined by what cards are available in the set, and particularly at common.
Yeah, absolutely. What about bombs? What role do bombs play in your resource management game when it comes to your creatures?
So bombs kind of always do different things, and in fact, I think one of the ways to maybe start getting better at playing your limited deck is to evaluate, does this bomb favor me trading, or does this bomb favor me saving and conserving creatures, right? So, for example, if you have a card like Overrun in your deck, right? Overrun is kind of a classic green card. You want more creatures if you have Overrun, especially if you have it in your hand, which means you don't want to trade as much. So this means you generally don't want to attack your creatures into your opponent's creature to offer a trade, and a lot of times you end up not wanting to block your creatures. And the reason is because obviously Overrun is a card that, the more creatures you have, the better off you'll be. Whereas the flip side of that is maybe a card like a Planeswalker. If you have a Planeswalker in your opening hand, or in your hand in a limited game, you may want to trade very aggressively, right? Because a Planeswalker is much better on a board without creatures, and a Planeswalker, most of the time, if it's left unchecked for several turns, will take over a game just all by itself. So really, the types of cards you have can determine how you play the game, even from turn 2 forward, right? Do you block your opponent's bear when they attack with it, or do you leave your bear in play?
Yeah.
So
A good example of something similar to Overrun, when I think of Soul of Theros, when back in that limited format, and how you would just like let things hit you because eventually you were going to play that card, and the game was going to completely swing in your favor once your guys had lifelink and all of that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the Black Soul, it's not as good as the White Soul in terms of its power level, but it was still pretty good. But the Black Soul is a great example of a card
that you would
want
trade
to
off.
trade. You would want to trade aggressively, because when you play the Black Soul, you are able to return all those creatures you traded off, and then get a huge advantage in the later game against your opponent. So I think the Souls are a good example of a position of, do you want to trade with your cards, or do you want to try and conserve your creatures on the battlefield?
Exactly. What about life total? What is something I think that the thing that I hear the most is one of the biggest misnomers in Magic is I was winning the game. I had him at 1 life, for 8 turns. I was winning that game, and people use the life total as a score rather than as a resource. Drew, why does that happen, and how do you fix that?
I mean, really, I think a big part of that is just the basic way people evaluate how they're winning a game, right? A lot of sports and things like that, basketball, football, baseball, whatever it is, the higher the score is, the better you're doing, right? And if for example, in a basketball game, someone has a high lead at the beginning of say that, the second half, say you're up by 20, 30 points or whatever, that's an advantage you have. But Magic, it's weird because it's a little bit different, right? Because like you're saying, life total really is a resource. It's something you can use to try and create some sort of advantage in the later game. And I think the simplest way to think about that in terms of a Magic game is chump blocking. The difference between a new player and a good player in determining when they need to chump block, I think, is really important. And I see new players do this all the time, particularly like at pre-releases, where their opponent will have a creature that maybe has 3 or 4 power, and their opponent attacks them with that creature, and they decide they're going to chump with one of their small creatures, and they're at, say, 18 life or 20 life or something like that. So really, there's no reason to throw away a creature like that. It's a creature you can hold on to. Maybe your opponent ends up playing a Hulking Devil, right, on that turn, and you don't have a 2-power creature to block that creature later, or the fact that you can attack your opponent as well and set up a position where you attacking their life total maybe gives you a chance to win a race with, say, flyers or something like that. So I think chump blocking is one of the easiest ways, one of the easiest scenarios to think, should I block this creature just to save my life total? And the reality is that when they attack with that 4-power creature, if you go from 20 to 16, you're still not dead to that creature for another 4 or 5 turns, right? And there's things you can do. Maybe play your own creature that can trade with that creature later, and then you have a creature that can attack your opponent's life total, or chump block, say, an 8-power creature in the later game when you're at 8 life. And really learning to really understand that the permanence you have in play a lot of times can be much more important than your life total.
Yeah, I think that one of the ones in a similar vein that I see is people, not using their life as a resource and, wasting removal spells on things that can be dealt with other creatures later down the line, kind of like you talked about. Whereas maybe they're not even chump blocking, maybe they're just spending something like a Searing Blaze or a Searing Blood, whatever your spell is, on this 3 toughness creature because you only have a 2/2 in play. But you have a 3/4 that you're going to be able to play in 2 turns, and it can be something that I think is really hard for people to realize, that they have that option to not cast that removal spell, to take a few hits and really leverage that removal spell for something a little bit better down the line.
Yeah, particularly say your deck is soft to flyers, right?
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty classic example of I don't have a lot of ways to deal with flyers, mostly just my removal spells. I don't have a lot of reach creatures, or I don't have any flying creatures of my own. So if you spend your removal spell, right, like if you spend like a lightning strike on just like a vanilla 3/3, a creature that you can block later on. With some of your other creatures, and then your opponent plays a flyer after you've used the lightning strike on the vanilla 3/3, you may end up just dying to the flyer because you did expend your removal spell that way. Really, I think in limited, when it comes to using your removal spells, a good habit to get in, and this isn't always true. Magic is constantly about reevaluating what you're doing, but I think a good mindset or good paradigm to have is that you want to develop your creatures early, and then use your removal spells in the middle to later turns to leverage, either to leverage an advantage or to stunt your opponent's advantage.
Yeah, let's move on to removal a little bit. I want to talk about a few different things. One of the ones I want to talk about is big removal, little guy removal. So, things like, Humble the Brute versus things like maybe a Shock.
Yeah, so cards like Humble the Brute are... They are the kind of card that you're probably going to be happy to have access to one of them in your deck. You may start one, but once you start adding more than one, they start to get a little bit worse.
What does it do in the resource management game when you think about, for example, you have a plethora of removal, right? And understanding when to cast your Humble the Brute on either guy versus something else can be a hard decision for a lot of players, I think. I think that when you like, it's the similar thing to that shock mentality or that searing spear mentality where they just point and click with it rather than really thinking about it.
I mean, so you kind of have to ask yourself, do I think my opponent has a lot of 4 power creatures or higher in their deck, right?
Right.
Am I playing versus a green-red deck that has a whole bunch of werewolves? So do I really need to kill that? I'm trying to think of it. Like, do I really need to kill, say, that Gastoff Arsonist with this, or do I need to save it for when they flip their guy, or when they get possibly even a more powerful werewolf? Or you can think to yourself the alternative, which is maybe I'm playing versus a deck where they maybe don't have any 4-power creatures. Did they just use a pump spell on one of their creatures, and should I use the Humble the Brute now to ensure that this card isn't dead in my hand? And you kind of have to evaluate that as you're playing versus your opponent, and the colors will determine that a little bit too, right? White and black, for example, tend to have smaller creatures in them, and then green and to a little bit of a lesser extent red, generally tend to have bigger creatures in them. So if you're playing versus a green deck, you probably don't have to necessarily just kill that backward survivalist right away with Humble the Brute. You can probably wait and use it to kill a much larger werewolf, say a flipped Uvenwall captive that you would have a harder time dealing with, because it's a lot easier to block a 3 toughness creature than it is to block like a 6 toughness creature.
Absolutely. What about those small? Maybe shock isn't a good example. What about something like magma spray?
So I mean, to me, magma spray and shock are pretty.
They're the
close.
same to me too, but they may not be to the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the fact that you can point a shock at your opponent's head it's not entirely irrelevant, but it's mostly irrelevant, right? You're not playing shock to do 2 damage to your opponent. There are situations where that will come up, right? Where, my opponent's at 2 life, I do shock, I kill them. But those are much rarer than just, I use this to kill a creature. So that was a lot of elaboration of basically we're just talking about, spells that are very cheap, that maybe cost 1 red, that deal 2 damage to something. And those, you can be a little more aggressive with those in terms of how you want to spend them. And the reason being is that sometimes you want to use them to create a tempo advantage, right? Say you play a 2-drop on turn 2, then you play another 2-drop on turn 2 or on turn 3, and you also have a red up for your we could say Galvanic Bombardment or Magma Spray or whatever it is.
Sure.
And then your opponent plays a creature that you can kill with that, right? Say they play like a 3-drop, like a 3/2 for 3. It can be very beneficial for you to use it on that turn. You have 2 2-drops. Now your opponent has no creatures, and on your 4th turn, hopefully you have like a 4-drop, and that can put you in a very commanding position to win the game. So just the tempo play alone sometimes is worth that mana investment, but sometimes it can be worth considering. Am I going to be able to generate enough an advantage with that play?
Even in your exact situation, right? You're still really favored with those 2/2/2s just to attack and not use that shock.
Yeah, you will still be in a pretty decent position, but sometimes what can happen is, and possibly it can depend on the context of your hand, right? Maybe you have like 4 other creatures in your hand and only that shock, so then yeah, you may be more interested in trading because you can just refill the board. Or maybe you only have 2 or 3 creatures total and you've got removal spells, or you've got like a threaten effect in your hand, and so really you want to clear that creature, that early creature out, get a bunch of damage in, and then kill your opponent with a threaten. So the context of your hand can also determine, do I want to trade? Do I want to use the removal spell on this vanilla creature? And like we talked about earlier, it may be in a situation where, maybe my opponent played both a 2-drop into a 3-drop and I only have the 1 removal spell, so removing it, I don't get as much of an advantage as I would if they had no creatures in play.
Let's talk about unconditional removal and how that plays into the resource management game. I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but I think this is what people misplay the most.
Yeah, I would agree, because I think unconditional removal can be very difficult to play, and the reason is because sometimes it is correct to play it on a vanilla creature. Right? Sometimes you have 2 or 3 creatures and your opponent only has 1, and maybe it's just like a 4/4 or something like that, so it's not great. it's not insane, but it's still a decently sized creature, and you really should just kill it just to, press a bunch of damage in and hopefully maybe finish your opponent off next turn or the turn after that. But sometimes, if you do that, like, you do that and then all of a sudden they untap and play, say, like, a 5/5 flyer or something like that. Then you're like, man, I wish I'd saved my, my murder to kill that creature instead. So really, it can be very difficult to determine, do I need to hold this or do I just need to use it right now to get an immediate advantage and then hope my opponent doesn't have a better follow-up than the creature I just killed. And I think that's the most difficult thing about unconditional removal. Generally a card like Shock, if your opponent plays a 2-drop, a lot of times it's not that big of a deal if you do kill it, because especially if you can press an advantage, because even if they play a flyer, if you're ahead on the ground anyways, it's not going to be that big of a deal for them to be racing you. But a card like unconditional removal can be really important in terms of, do I need to be able to attack to win the game? Can I win the game next turn if my opponent plays a bigger creature? Or am I using this and just not getting anything out of it? So...
Right. I think it can be, it's one of those pivotal decisions that you make in a game, and it's just so easy to make the wrong one when you think that the game is about something that it's not.
Yeah. Yep. That's generally pretty true. Yeah. It's interesting that, the card, because really unconditional removal gives you the most choices, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Which is why it's easy to misplay.
Yep. So the card that gives you the most choices does give you the potential to make, to make the worst kind of play. So yeah, it's just something.
How do you avoid it, do you think?
Really just playing more Magic and just knowing, yeah, I can do this. For example, like I said, say you have 3 creatures, your opponent has a 4/4, and you use a murder on it and you attack them down to, say, 5 life. At that point, you probably don't care even if they follow up with another big creature, right? Because you can probably just attack them, to kill them next turn. But you also don't want to, say the board's stalled, right? So say they've got like 3 creatures and you have 3 creatures and you can't really attack into each other, so you've been sitting there. You probably don't want to just murder their biggest creature for no reason at all, right? Like if you can't attack anyways, there's not really a reason to do that. And I see that happen sometimes where people will just use an unconditional removal spell, kill a random creature in a board stall, and they don't get anything out of it, and then in 2 or 3 turns their opponent top decks a more powerful creature and then plays it, and then they lose the game. So really you have to evaluate, what am I getting out of killing their creature, or what am I preventing my opponent from getting by killing the creature? So that's, I think really that's just something, by playing more, you'll kind of get the feeling of, yeah, I should use this here. I'm going to be able to attack for a bunch of damage, or no, I shouldn't use this here because I don't get anything out of it because the board's stalled. So that's something that you just kind of have to evaluate as the game's going on.
Let's talk about one last thing that you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but this is a resource that is very, very important and limited, and I think causes gives you a lot of free wins in a lot of cases, and that's mana efficiency. Whether it's tempo, doing cast rather than casting that 4-drop, maybe casting those 2/2 drops. Doing different things with your mana to put yourself in a better position to win the game. How is mana a resource, whether it's getting it out of your opponent or using it correctly yourself?
Mana it's one of those things that, like you were saying, you want to be as efficient with your mana on every turn that you possibly can, right? Because if you view mana as a resource, but say you don't tap a couple of your lands every turn, say you play a 2-drop on turn 3, or you play like a 3-drop on turn 5, in the theoretical sense, you're underusing your resources, right? You didn't use that land on that turn, or you didn't use 2 or 3 lands on that turn. So it's like every turn you're not using your lands, your mana, basically, you are missing an opportunity to generate any sort of resource advantage over your opponent. So really, mana efficiency is really important. there's a reason, you play on your mana curve is because it allows you to develop your resources as the game is going on. So what this means is you want to evaluate, how do I be more mana efficient than my opponent? One thing you can think of is, do I want to play, for example, let's say your opponent doesn't have any creatures in play, and it's your turn 3, and you have a 3/2 in your hand and a 1/4 in your hand, and they both cost 3 mana. And these are creatures that you will probably run into a lot in various limited formats. They may have abilities or things like that, but really let's just look at the vanilla creature. If your opponent doesn't have any creatures in play, I think I want to play the 3/2 in that situation. And I know we're kind of talking about mana, and I'm talking about evaluating creature stats, but
I think that's important, though.
Yeah, and the reason you do that is because what that means is that now you can attack your opponent for a lot more damage, which will hopefully end the game sooner for you. But let's reevaluate the board if your opponent has a 2/2, right? And again, I have a 3/2 and a 1/4 in my hand. In this situation, I probably want to play a 1/4, right? Because I don't want to trade my 3/2 for their 2/2 at any point. So if I play the 1/4, I hold off their 2/2, and then I can reevaluate, do I want to play this 3/2 on my next turn, or maybe I have a 4-drop in my hand. So doing things like that, like leveraging your mana advantage, can be something as simple as evaluating what vanilla creature do I play in any given board state.
Yep. And you touched on it with removal earlier, but using different things, when you think about mana efficiency, I think of a card like Unsubstantiate. This card I have found this card to be great. And the reason that it's great is because it has so much flexibility. I love cards like Disperse. And the reason is because when used correctly, they can really offer you something that you can't get in a lot of other ways. And that's that mana advantage, and using that mana is a resource advantage. If you're lucky, a lot of people like to talk about the times where they got to just when their opponent from a pump spell and got a card out of their card, and it was a huge blowout. But that isn't always the case with the cards like that, or even cards like Shock, for example, where you killed their 3/2 and got an extra 2 points of damage that might have actually turned out to be 6 points of damage down the line. So that Shock really pulled a lot of weight for you by time walking your opponent as well as dealing them some damage. And the thing is like it's something that we do a lot in Constructed, a lot. That we use tempo and mana advantage a ton there. But I think that it actually came from Limited, where people learn how to do this a lot and have applied it a lot more to constructed games. And I, for one, always need to work on this because I'm not great at it. And it's something that I know that I've learned a lot about that I'm excited to learn more about in the future.
Yeah, I mean, tempo really is, and people always say this about tempo, is that it is the most difficult concept definitely to explain. And it's much more difficult to understand tempo than it is card advantage, right? Card advantage, is generally fairly simple to understand. There's some nuances and some complexities to it. For example, when you have 10 lands in play and you draw a land, it's like you effectively didn't draw anything at all. You essentially skipped a draw step because the land isn't worth anything. But obviously, in the early turns of the game, lands are very important and very valuable. So, with a couple caveats, card advantage isn't too difficult to understand once you understand the basic concepts of playing Magic. But tempo is something that is like constantly, it's in flux, it's changing. Some things could be great because, you could say something like unsummoning, I unsummon my opponent's 5-drop, right? That's a tempo advantage in the theoretical sense, right? Like, I spent 1 mana, my opponent spent 5 mana, and now they're going to re-spend 5 mana, so they essentially spent 10 mana on their creature, which is a huge tempo advantage for you. But say you don't get anything out of the tempo advantage, right? Say you used the unsummon on the 5-drop, but your opponent wasn't attacking with the creature anyway. Say it was like a 3/5 and it was just walking your creatures, and you couldn't really attack because, say, maybe they had a 1/4 or something like that as well, and then your opponent just replays the card next turn. It's like, did you really get a tempo advantage, or did you just force your opponent to spend 5 mana again? So really, like, you could try and learn about tempo in a theoretical sense, but it's going to be constantly adjusting, is a particular play a tempo positive play, or is a particular play a tempo negative play, and how do you determine that? And that's something that's going to constantly change in any given game, and really knowing, yes, this is a tempo positive play and I want to make this play to really get an advantage over my opponent, or no, even though in the theoretical this is a tempo positive play, but it doesn't do anything for me, so I don't want to do anything, so it constantly changes, and it's one of the difficult concepts to learn, I think.
Yep. All right. I think that'll do it. I think at the end of the day, what I hope that you can take away from this podcast is there's lots of things going on in a match of Magic, and being able to identify what games are about and what resources you're going to be maximizing in each and every game, and being able to maximize each and every resource is going to win you more games in the long run, and it's something that you should really concentrate on learning about. I think that resource management is the biggest thing that will make you get better at Magic, and I really encourage everybody to try and learn how to manage those resources better. Drew, where can people find you?
I'm on Facebook, Andrew Walden, and then I'm also on Twitter at MTGDrew. And like you said, I write over at GameGrid, so playatgamegrid.com.
You can find me on Facebook at Spencer Stephen Howland. You can find me on Twitter at Spencer13H. And you can find me on Moto at Spencer13Dev, where you can also join the Constructive Criticism clan. You can also find the podcast every week on MTGcast, 5-Color Combo, and ConstructorCriticism.com. And probably in the next couple of weeks, it will also be going up on playatgamegrid.com. I'm waiting for the website to get updated, but I might not wait actually. So we'll see. Drew, do you have any shout-outs this week?
Yeah, I want to give a shout-out to Dave Toe. He is one of the owners of GameGrid. I think he was a big part of the reason for having kind of the successful convention we did, not just for Magic, but for all the games we were running. He put a lot of work in, basically, I really feel like he was the guy that was really kind of the glue holding everything together. So big shout out to him. He was also really open to a lot of the suggestions that I had when it came to trying to get players to come out to the convention to play in the tournament. And we're going to take what we learned from this and kind of reevaluate, but he's really open to those things. He's always super awesome, and he loves giving out lots of prizes for the players. So
I just have a huge shout out to GameGrid. It's hard in this day and age to run tournaments like this because there's just PPTQs every weekend. You don't want players to get burned out, and it was amazing. It was an amazing event. It was smaller than I'm sure that they would have liked, but overall, just completely pleased with what they've done to give back to the community, and GameGrid constantly earns my respect, and I really appreciate everything that they do. So shout out to them. Don't forget to check out our sponsors at GameGrid and 5-Color Combo. They're both great places to check out Magic content from GameGrid and 5-Color Combo, as well as download the 5-Color Combo's app. You can also get the tokens, the classic card tokens. Just check in the show notes. You can get a link to that. And we look forward to seeing you guys all next week to talk about some more Magic.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love limited Magic. I do like constructed, but drafting is just it will always probably be my favorite format.
Yeah, next week I think we might talk about MTGO a little bit and how to maximize that as a resource. With the sealed leagues, draft leagues, and 8-4s, draft leagues right around the corner. We'll probably talk about MTGO and how to use it a little bit better and things like that a little bit next week. And we're excited to be doing this every week, and we look forward to speaking to you guys more. I'm with Drew. I love limited Magic.
It really is. I think the most. It's the most fun for me. I mean, it's one of those things where you're sitting down, you're building a deck, you're constantly thinking about like I said, like evaluating cards and stuff. And I think it's I'm going to preach this all the time, is that I think if you want to really get better at just fundamentally being good at Magic, just play more limited. So.
Yep. All right. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you guys all next week.
See you guys next week.